Good afternoon. My name is Bethany Servin, and I work in marketing here at UsableNet. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, AI and Web Accessibility, a Technical and Legal Perspective. We're delighted to have all of you with us, as well as our special guest speaker, Lori Summerfield. Lori is a partner in Troutman Pepper's Consumer Financial Services Practice Group and has practiced law for over 20 years in private practice, in-house, and federal government settings. Lori specializes in regulatory compliance with federal and state anti-discrimination laws, including the ADA, fair lending laws, and responsible banking laws. Prior to joining Troutman Pepper, Lori held significant positions as in-house counsel at major financial institutions and served as outside counsel for financial services clients with two nationally recognized law firms, Ballard Spahr and Buckley Sandler.
Bethany, thank you so much for having me today, and it's a pleasure to join you all. I'd just like to underscore that I'm not a litigator, so I won't subject you to a detailed case law discussion today. And also, I wanted to clarify that my remarks don't constitute legal advice, and they represent my personal views and not those of my employer, Troutman Pepper.
This webinar is produced by UsableNet, a recognized leader in accessibility and digital inclusion. Our first speaker, Jason Taylor, Chief Innovation Officer, will share a bit more about us and get us started. Jason?
Thanks, Bethany. And thanks, Laurie, for joining me. I think having Laurie's individual sort of legal input around this subject area, she's actually tracking artificial intelligence in a number of areas. So her collective sort of knowledge in this space, I think is going to be quite relevant for this particular topic. As Bethany talked about, UsableNet have been around 20 years. Essentially, we're helping as best we can companies support their assistive users across different types of mobile, web, and digital experiences. And we wanted to put this webinar on because we're getting a lot of questions. I'd imagine that every industry is getting lots of questions around how AI could potentially help them achieve some of their goals, and what part of AI is overhyped inside the particular studies. So, wanted to start off on the agenda front is just give a very high level view of AI. What are we talking about in terms of what area are we talking about, and then get into the use of AI in the different sort of aspects of web accessibility, assuming that we have a lot of different people with different roles on this call. So exploring how potentially AI could be used in the planning and the design phases today. What does it mean for the sort of testing and development? We wanted to look at, and Laurie's got some good perspective on this, some of the sort of AI promoted technologies such as accessibility widgets. And also Laurie's going to talk about some of the sort of legal compliance aspects that you may want to take into account if you're looking at AI as part of your overall solution. And then also we wanted to give a little prediction of how AI could potentially be a more prominent part of web accessibility and digital accessibility in general. So if I could just start, Bethany, with the first slide. So artificial intelligence, we're talking about the simulation of human intelligence. So it's not human intelligence, and we'll talk about the sort of role that AI can play. I don't know how many people on this call are experimenting using AI today, but me personally, I've been using ChatGPT on a daily basis. Part of my work to sort of check emails, give me suggestions of things like summaries for blog articles or technical specifications. And I find AI something that is potentially super empowering for every single person, including the disability community. When I look at AI specifically in the sort of web accessibility space or the digital accessibility space, first I think of AI that's been around with us for a little while already, which are voice assistants. So the work that Apple and Amazon have done in Siri and Alexa is significant in terms of opening up interfaces to a voice command and the ability for people who have, a limited ability to use devices to use their voice to explore and use technology has been a revolution in different spaces. So it's worth noting that AI has been around a while and is developed and has been developed by different companies. OpenAI is probably the one that most people have been talked about most recently. It essentially is something that's been basically trained to read everything out there on the internet. But its real power is the ability to generate unique content from what it's experienced, so what it's read and what it's seen. And there's actually 4 modules that are available off of AI today in different formats that are basically focused in different areas, where ChatGPT is focused primarily on generating text content. You might look something like DALL-E, which is primarily focused at generating images off of text input. So different modules to control the knowledge that OpenAI has basically built up over the years. An important note on OpenAI is essentially its knowledge is up until 2021. So, when you do ask it questions and get a response, you've got to understand that it doesn't know about recent changes. So in the world of web accessibility, it doesn't know about recent changes to WCAG 2.2, as an example. Then there's narrow AIs, which have also been around for a little while, but are very useful in, let's say, the digital space. One which I think I want to call out is the Microsoft image analyzer. Essentially, Microsoft has trained that image analyzer on billions of images. And essentially, the value of that is that it can be used to describe an image to a user, but it also can be used to prevent certain images being displayed in certain environments because of what the analyzer knows or perceives that the image is portraying. So those are sort of the big level AIs that we come across, that we're thinking about and tracking in terms of how they might potentially affect web accessibility and digital accessibility in a broader sense. So let's get specific into sort of how you could potentially use some of these today. An area I think you should be using it on a regular basis is if you're in the process of doing planning or design. There's lots of value in using some of these, especially OpenAI, to help you come up with base level content. Whether that's, for example, asking it to come up with an e-commerce accessibility testing plan. You'll be reasonably impressed by its detail, by the stages that it talks about, by the aspects that generates, because essentially it's read lots and lots about creating accessibility testing plans, and it basically has synthesized that down and generates a good outline that you can start using as your base. I wouldn't say you just cut and paste and that's your plan, but it helps you get started a lot quicker. There's other aspects with regard to testing. You could use some of these open AIs to suggest you and write you up personas for testing. So personas of screen reader users, for example. You can, after it gives you one, you can adjust it for a different age or different use cases. They're good at checking specific sort of aspects of accessibility in the planning phase. So potentially coming up with accessible color palettes or options for accessible color palettes. And also something that I've used recently quite a lot is checking content that we're generating that we may use in different formats for cognitive challenges, suggesting simplified descriptions for more technical documents. So very useful tools, especially in the plan and the design phase. But again, a caveat, you'll get to find, but essentially, especially OpenAI, which essentially is a sort of a new tool for generating new content, a lot of the time it's focused on being very credible, sounding very credible, but it doesn't know if it's correct or not. Only a human can go back in and make sure that it's correct or not. And I've put on here a really good article where a UX person used Midjourney, which Midjourney is almost like a cross between, it will generate a mix of images with text. And they were using Midjourney to basically give them ideas around an accessible color palette. But if you read this article, you'll see that, you know, the original color palettes that they give look quite credible, but when you actually then test every single combination that it suggests, lots of them fail the WCAG color contrasts, because Midjourney has no ability to do color contrasting in terms of its own nature. It's only taking what it thinks is the right combinations and giving those examples. So be clear that you're not looking at AI to be correct, but to assist you. Now, testing and development. These are big areas of sort of accessibility today. I would say that AI is touching on helping these areas. They're definitely not replacing these areas today, mainly due to the way that, one, the WCAG guidelines are worded, lots of wording around meaningful and equivalent. And those are primarily sort of human judgments. And there is potential areas where, for example, the narrow AI of Microsoft Image Analyzer, there are some solutions out there using that as a way of sort of giving you examples of alt tags that might be, or alternative text that might be good for an image. I would still say that you're probably going to have to manually check those examples, but they're good for giving a starting point of the types of alt tags you might want to use. The main reason why, you know, AI has yet to sort of, let's say, take hold of this particular sector is artificial intelligence needs lots and lots of data points, billions of data points, to be more and more correct and learn. That means that, you know, there needs to be this huge amount of data that you actually train AI on, and that data just doesn't exist today in the accessibility space. But over time, you know, AI will always get better. The one thing about artificial intelligence, it doesn't go to sleep. It gets better. It learns. So essentially, we do see that there's potential for AI to help more in the testing and development. We are seeing developers use ChatGPT to suggest code corrections, or even check the code that they're thinking of using to remedy some of those accessibility features. So from a development assistance point of view, you could see that developing more and more in the future, where developers who want to take away tedious tasks start to use things like ChatGPT to suggest different types of coding. Unfortunately, it doesn't really help most companies, because the remedies that are needed to fix barriers that are being found are typically quite complex. They require different departments involved. They might need a design change along with a dev, along with QA. So essentially, just coming up with a code suggestion, which typically is HTML based, primarily won't help organizations, especially if they've got dynamic systems that they're building off of, you know, where the actual platforms are dynamically generating their content, because the actual fixes need to be done at the server side, not at the client side, which is essentially what ChatGPT would recommend today. A question we get asked a lot is, but isn't automated testing that you see today, where a website scanned, thousands of pages of websites are scanned, and on every page, the system finds things that are wrong with that page. Isn't that some type of form of AI or soft AI? The answer to that is no. In a short term, there are going to be aspects where some of those automated tests, if they're, for example, on images, could start to use AI to help verify that the label used on the image is the same as visually what you see on the page. But again, this is very narrow in focus. It might help with images, but probably won't help quickly with the broader sort of barriers that most assistive users find on more complicated websites. Where they've got keyboard traps and different types of functionality which needs to be rewritten to make sure it's accessible. But again, I don't doubt that there's going to be some really smart people that are trying to leverage artificial intelligence to make automated testing better than it is today. But primarily what you're seeing out there today is not a form of artificial intelligence. It's essentially a form of sort of rules-based checking against WCAG's technical specs. So let's move on to sort of like one area that AI gets talked about a lot in web accessibility, and that's AI-powered accessibility widgets. Now, for those that don't really grasp exactly what we mean by a widget, I'll just give you a description. Essentially, these are typically very affordable solutions promoted primarily to smaller website owners. I put up a visualization of one, but I'm going to describe it for those who can't see the actual image. But essentially, they rely a lot on providing a control panel that pops up and gives a varied set of controls to potentially improve the experience for people who need different types of assistance. The primary problem with this from a technical point of view is it adds another technical layer for assistive users. So most likely people who really need help have their own assistive technology. They want to use that assistive technology directly on the website and not rely on another piece of technology to guide them through. And Laurie might give her input next on sort of what she's seen and what she's heard in this particular space. The reason why AI-based accessibility widgets have not exploded is because they haven't wowed the end user. The consumer that they're aimed at, the assistive users, primarily don't particularly like this approach. They haven't been wowed by this technology. And that's primarily because there's very, very little artificial intelligence in the actual system itself. They are, again, using very narrow uses of artificial intelligence, for example, to help with, again, images and potentially writing in alt tags correctly for those images. That again is an interesting component, but it's not the biggest barrier for most people who are using websites. Barriers are far more complex than just a description of an alt tag. So they've been helpful for some simple websites. They do offer some assistance for certain type of users. But for me, the biggest problem with these widgets is they don't help screen reader users. They are primarily the biggest group of users that are prevented from using digital experiences. And it sort of allows me to segue into Laurie. Screen reader users are the types of people who sue other companies, companies that have a website they can't use. And I'll get Laurie to talk about how that sort of dovetails into what she's seen on the legal front of these AI-powered web accessibility widgets. Laurie, if you could take it from there.
Certainly, Jason. And I absolutely agree with you. I mean, we see time and again in the case law that individuals who are blind or have low vision frequently are suing companies over inaccessible websites because it deals with use of their screen reader or their inability to use it effectively on the site to have the full and equal access and enjoyment of being able to peruse websites for products and services. Jason has asked me to comment on a couple of key questions here in terms of a legal perspective on these AI-powered accessibility widgets. And one of the questions is whether the use of an AI-powered widget can serve as an effective legal defense. In my view, companies that have designed or modified their websites to be accessible rather than using a widget to mask the existing accessibility barriers do have a defense in litigation. And we see this play out in case law, as well as enforcement actions by the US Department of Justice. And by the way, going forward, whenever I refer to the Department of Justice, I'll probably just say DOJ during this presentation. We also see that using a widget or an overlay alone doesn't provide a defense in litigation, because we know that accessibility barriers are often noticeable and in fact continue to exist on websites that utilize widgets and overlays. I think a second key question here is whether the use of an AI-powered accessibility widget increases or decreases the risk of litigation. And I think we've seen that it actually increases the risk of being sued. We know this because any companies that utilize widgets are targeted not only in formal litigation, but they also typically receive demand letters. According to UsableNet's year-end report, almost 600 companies that used a widget were sued in 2022. And specifically to the statistics on that, businesses using accessibility widgets received almost 600 lawsuits, specifically 575. And that represents a 36% increase from 2021. Many of those lawsuits also list the widget features as a barrier to equal access, in addition to potential violations of the WCAG standards and other user web type of barriers. But as we all know, demand letters aren't publicly available, and so there's no way to track those statistics. But there are many more demand letters than lawsuits filed. That we know for certain. So the number of demand letters sent to companies using widgets is likely much higher than 575, based on those 2022 statistics that UsableNet gathered. So in my view, there's definitely risk in trying to rely upon AI-powered accessibility widgets, both as a legal defense and also because it's likely going to increase the risk of litigation. So in my view, there really isn't a safe harbor here from litigation when you use a widget. And there's really no substitute from using a qualified website accessibility consultant who can offer you the experience in conducting both automated manual as well as user testing, and also assisting with remediation of accessibility deficiencies. Bethany, next slide, please. I also would like to comment on the issue of whether the use of widgets and overlays results in a net benefit to users, both generally and users with disabilities in particular. And Jason and I thought this slide was helpful to share with you. It's actually showing some statistics from a WebAIM survey back in January of 2021. So let me just give a little bit of an intro here before we actually talk about these statistics. Disability advocates and accessibility experts have argued that widgets and overlays often make websites more difficult to use. And users describe AI-powered widgets and overlays as redundant oftentimes. And at worst, the programs can render websites almost unusable by interfering with assistive technologies, just as Jason discussed. It's also pretty notable, I think, that in 2021, over 700 web developers and accessibility advocates signed an open letter calling on companies to stop using these widgets. But let's turn to the WebAIM survey. So this survey that was conducted by the nonprofit accessibility organization WebAIM found that more than 2/3 of industry professionals reported that these types of products were not effective. And as shown in this slide, 69% of respondents rated widgets and overlays as not at all effective or not very effective. Individuals with disabilities had even less favorable views, with 72% of respondents providing the same too low ratings. So I think this is very telling. Even if it would be easier to use a widget, even if it would be less expensive, which is one of the big arguments for having an easy and effective solution, I think the user reaction at the end of the day is what's really important here, as well as the legal considerations.
Yeah, Laurie, that sort of brings me to sort of ask you a question I was thinking about, because you're right in saying that there's a lot of data out there about users not particularly loving it, but a lot of companies are really just focused on, I want to do, and I want to be safe from the ADA. I want to make sure that what I put on, what I do, sort of protects me from ADA lawsuits. And a lot of these companies, promote that you'll be in a good place if you use their AI-based widgets with regard to the ADA. So if you're just considering, hey, I'm not really focused on the actual end users. Maybe I don't think I have many end users that are assistive users, but I do care about the ADA and making sure that I'm compliant with the ADA. Would you recommend in that sort of narrow use these widgets to just comply with the ADA? And if so, why would that work? And if so, why not?
No, Jason, I wouldn't recommend that, because widgets and overlays only create an experience that approximates accessibility for individuals with disabilities. And that experience is really based on the perception of this alternative website interface, not actually remediating the underlying code to make it actually accessible. And I think as you and most listeners on our call today know, Title III of the ADA that governs public accommodations states that it's discriminatory if a public accommodation fails to provide full and equal access to products and services. And of course, the ADA doesn't explicitly apply to websites, but it's been interpreted that way by the DOJ and the various federal and state courts. So a widget provides a separate, but not necessarily equal experience for individuals with disabilities. So I think it fails on that score of the need to provide full and equal access to individuals with disabilities. Secondly,
Yeah, interesting. Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was just going to add that, the ADA and DOJ regulations also require that public accommodations engage in effective communication with individuals with disabilities. And based on the anecdotal evidence we've heard, which is plentiful, and you mentioned this yourself, Jason, widgets often interfere with assistive technology like screen readers that are used by the blind. So they undercut the ability to deliver that effective communication that's required. So for these reasons, I don't think that widgets or overlays meet the legal requirements of the ADA or DOJ regulations that implement the act.
So sort of setting aside widgets and overlays, and thinking more about, hey, there's lots of work going on by good people in the sort of web accessibility space, testing and remediating for accessibility. What's your thoughts on the risk of sort of relying on AI to carry out some of this work? What do you see as do you see as a sort of a AI significantly reliable right now? Like how would you sort of summarize what you're seeing being talked about in the sort of legal space?
Well, I think AI holds great promise for the future for accessibility and for individuals with disabilities to effectively use it. But I don't think that AI is sufficiently advanced at this stage or has appropriate safeguards in place to use it without exercising legal knowledge and judgment. And I'm speaking in this perspective from a lawyer. Although I do think you could use it to do some preliminary work. So let me sort of expand on that. For example, you could use ChatGPT to generate an initial draft of an accessibility policy or an accessibility statement, but you'd still need an attorney or a compliance professional to review them to determine whether they actually comply with the ADA and DOJ regulations, and also to ensure that business operational and risk management concerns are integrated into those documents. So, personally, I would never rely on ChatGPT or any other types of AI-powered tools to provide legal advice. And I don't think that AI could ever supplant professional legal judgment. But yet I do think that there is promise and the possibility of using it in the future, both for lawyers as well as for individuals within businesses that are involved in more of the day-to-day operational and risk management associated with ADA compliance.
Yeah, thank you for that that perspective. I mean, I want to sort of I think we want to cover two last areas. One is I want to be a little bit more I would say, quote unquote, positive around AI. I want to make it very clear that personally, I think artificial intelligence could be as important to the disability community from a use perspective and how people are empowered as the internet was. I believe that all the things that are currently out there and making lots of noise around, for example, ChatGTP, it's a completely accessible interface. Every single person pretty much on the planet can benefit from the power of ChatGTP, regardless of their disability. So it has already empowered the disability community as much as every other community. And I think that AI, with a focus of accessible interfaces to those environments, can be game changing from an end user perspective. But as someone who sort of specialized in web accessibility and helping companies sort of deal with their current projects or future projects, some of the things that I see or I predict AI can really help with in the future might be, for example, number one, I would love to see the big CMS platforms, whether that's Wix or Foursquare or Shopify, starting to use AI to ensure that the first website that's built is accessible, giving help, making sure that people who are building on those platforms aren't able to make mistakes, are encouraged to use accessibility. I already see AI being promoted by these platforms to help you start an e-commerce site faster than ever before. So the power exists there for them to control the output and giving AI its place in that generating the new website and making sure it's accessible would resolve lots of issues for lots of small companies, which are turning to, for example, accessibility widgets because there's not an affordable solution and the website that was built for them has problems. So, the first thing I would love to see AI do is really improve the overall digital experience that's being generated by some of the bigger CMS guys in terms of who are populating the world with websites. I could see that AI could over time learn also how screen readers are used by the disability community and emulate those and help companies find those big barriers quicker, remediate those barriers and fix those barriers quicker. Yes, it's possible for companies right now to engage users of screen reading technology, but the feedback mechanism is quite slow. The ability to get those users to sort of test your, for example, website that you're launching in 3 months isn't so easy. There's lots of challenges in incorporating users of disability in the process, and essentially AI could essentially help companies bring that sort of knowledge faster and quicker to development. I do see a great value in AI being connected to the developers. And I don't mean developers who are just remediating accessibility, but developers who are working live on websites they're building today, using ChatGTP or other types of digital assistants to help them make sure, again, they're not making mistakes early on when they build websites, that they're doing the best accessibility job as they build those websites. So digital assistants plugged into the big platforms like Shopify, like BigCommerce in the e-commerce space, like IBM WebSphere, sort of to bring the accessibility expert to the hands of developers who are building websites today. I see AI developing over the years to bring this sort of expertise to everybody. Today, a lot of companies have to rely on hiring an expert in accessibility, but essentially AI could become that common resource of being an accessibility expert to all the different types of people who are involved in building digital experiences, whether that's AI plugged into Figma for the UX team, AI plugged into the CMS, different types of assistance in different places. The other thing is looking at how, you can take these sort of very technical reports about websites and make them a lot more easier to interact with for non-technical people. Essentially looking at how you can simplify quizzing how well your company's doing, tracking how well your company's doing on inclusivity, and not needing to be a technical expert to understand that. Laurie, we wanted to spend the last sort of like 5 minutes or so also talking about what you're seeing in terms of sort of in the AI space in the sort of government regulatory area.
Happy to discuss that topic, Jason. So with the explosion of innovation in AI, there are inevitably going to be new laws and guidance that are governing AI development, deployment, and usage, both at the federal and the state level. So I'm going to talk somewhat about some of the highlights that we're seeing today that you should all be aware of. So first of all, the Biden administration proposed a blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights last fall, to build protections into AI systems. And that blueprint basically identifies 5 principles to guide design, use, and deployment of automated systems in order to protect the American public. So those 5 principles, just in brief, are promoting safe and effective systems, preventing algorithmic discrimination. That's been a big theme under the Biden administration and various federal agencies that are tasked with enforcing the civil rights laws. Third, data privacy, making sure that you know where your data is going, how it's being used, and your right to protect it. There's also a 4th principle called notice and explanation. And that is that you should know that an automated system is being used and understand how and why it contributes to outcomes or decisions that impact you. So this could be things like credit decisions, employment decisions, anything that basically could have an impact on your life, your career, your finances. And the 5th principle is human alternatives, consideration, and fallback. That probably requires a little bit of explanation, but it basically means that you should be able to opt out where appropriate and have access to a human being, an actual person who can quickly consider and remedy problems that you encounter. You shouldn't have to just accept the result from an automated system, but you should be able to avail yourself of human intervention. So that's what's going on at the executive level and the White House and the leadership that we're seeing exercised there by President Biden and his administration. We've also seen several AI-focused bills introduced in Congress, but unfortunately, none have gained significant support to date. Just tying back to both of these first 2 bullets on the slide, just yesterday, the Biden administration actually had a meeting with several of the leaders in the AI space, and basically are trying to have some discussions about the industry itself placing some voluntary guardrails around the use of AI. So these are, companies like OpenAI and others that are leaders in this field. But it's interesting that the Biden administration is trying to, facilitate and nudge sort of a self-policing approach, in addition to trying to get underway some of these legislative activities. So third, I wanted to talk about the federal agencies and what they're doing to issue guidance and even propose rules. There's a lot going on at agencies. The FTC is taking a very active role in the proposed rule space, but there's been some important guidance that was issued by the NIST, and by the way, that's the National Institute of Standards and Technology, as well as a broad swath of federal agencies that include the DOJ and the federal banking agencies, in beginning to sort of put a line in the sand about how they're going to go about enforcing efforts against discrimination and bias in automated systems. So first of all, NIST released an AI risk management framework earlier this year, actually in January. And it's intended for voluntary use, and it's designed to improve ability to incorporate trustworthiness considerations into the design, development, and use of AI products, services, and systems. This is something that would be more universal in scope, but it sort of seems to be almost like a government version of the WCAG standards in a way, if you try to draw an analogy here. Secondly, just recently in April, as I mentioned, there were multiple federal agencies that released a joint statement on enforcement efforts against discrimination and bias in automated systems. And that includes AI. Obviously, that was a big focus of it. The joint statement expresses concern about the use of AI for discriminatory or anti-competitive purposes, and it outlines plans for enforcement going forward. Importantly, DOJ is in the mix here, and I think it's important to kind of understand what that guidance says. But basically, the agency state that, although AI and these automated tools offer a lot of promise for advancement, their use has the potential to perpetuate unlawful bias, automate unlawful discrimination, and produce other harmful outcomes for the American public. So the agencies go on to say that, hey, there are existing legal authorities on the books already today that apply to the use of automated systems and innovative new technologies, just like they apply to other practices. And of course, the agency is going to enforce those existing laws. There's also a statement that there's potential for discrimination in automated systems that come from different sources, such as data and data sets. Sometimes you can have automated system outcomes that are skewed by unrepresentative or imbalanced data sets, and they can incorporate historical bias, or data sets can contain various errors. And automated systems can correlate data with protected classes, which can lead to discriminatory outcomes. The agencies also point out that many automated systems are black boxes whose internal workings aren't clear to most people, and sometimes not even the developer of the tool. So that lack of transparency can make it more difficult for developers, businesses, and individuals to know whether the automated system is producing a fair outcome. And finally, the agencies point out that design and use can contribute to discrimination. Developers don't always understand or account for contexts in which private entities will or can use their automated systems. So developers can sometimes design systems on the basis of flawed assumptions about users, relevant context, and the underlying practices or procedures that it could replace. So at the end of the day, the agencies basically reiterate their resolve to monitor the development and use of automated systems and to promote responsible innovation. And again, this applies to AI. The agencies also pledge to vigorously use their collective authorities to protect individuals' rights, regardless of whether legal violations occur through traditional means or through advanced technologies. So to me, that's the first volley. That is the line in the sand about what we're going to see going forward. I'd also like to point out that in addition to these federal initiatives that we've just talked about, the states are also considering legislation to regulate AI. So I'll just give you a couple of examples of that. But the District of Columbia has a piece of legislation that is under consideration called Stop Discrimination by Algorithms Act of 2023. And it would prohibit disparate impact, require extensive disclosures to consumers about the use of AI, require audits of models, and even require users of models to file detailed reports about their audits with the DC Attorney General. So that's a piece of legislation to watch. Another example is Massachusetts. And I have to read the title of the legislation to you because I find it hilarious. An act drafted with the help of ChatGPT to regulate generative artificial intelligence models like ChatGPT. So you couldn't even make that up, but that is the actual name of the legislation. So that bill would prescribe certain operating standards for companies operating large-scale generative artificial intelligence models that would include things like no discrimination or bias based on protected class status. Text generated by the model has to be accompanied by a distinctive watermark to prevent plagiarism, and the need to obtain informed consent before using consumer data to train a model. So, we don't think that there's going to be widespread prohibitions on use of AI, I definitely think we're going to see legislative activity like this in some jurisdictions. And it's obvious that regulatory pressure will increasingly be applied to use of AI, both at the federal and the state level. So Jason, I'll turn it back to you, but hopefully that's a helpful overview of our predictions about the future of AI and web accessibility.
Yeah, Laurie, thank you so much. And we're going to take some Q&A for anyone who is on the call who have questions. We may not get to all the questions live, but we always answer all the questions. We're able to pull where the questions came from so we can respond to them. So don't be discouraged if your questions don't get answered on the actual live session. I think for me, the summary really needs to be that, especially in the web accessibility space, there's lots and lots of people who are doing great work. You should be looking at AI to help you do that great work and not replace you doing that great work right now. I think the legal part that Laurie's emphasizing is if you do start to rely on artificial intelligence to do anything that is quote unquote legally required, so essentially web accessibility is technically legally required, right? You're responsible for what that AI does. You can't be protected by the AI and say, oh, I'm sorry, we used AI, we didn't know. It's very clear already by the federal bodies saying anyone who, for example, in HR use AI for resume screening and are found that the AI discriminated, you're responsible for the AI discrimination because you chose to use that AI. So use it as a tool today to do the work that you're doing in a quicker, faster way. I wouldn't start recommending relying on AI to remove work that you're doing today, but AI should be part of your everyday activity, thinking about how AI could help you do your job better and faster. That would be my general input in terms of how AI is affecting particularly sort of web accessibility activity, whether that's design, whether that's testing, development, and project management stroke planning in that particular space. Bethany, could you put out a couple of questions for me and Laurie?
Yes, and I'm going to get us started by just answering one of the questions here. We did record today's session. We're going to take that recording, edit it a little bit, and then send it out to you early next week. So everyone will get an email early next week with instructions on how to view the recording on demand and how to download a PDF of the slides. So let's go ahead and get right into it. It's not necessarily a question, more of a comment about accessibility vendors starting to use AI for, they give an example of enhanced automated testing. Jason, can you tell us how is UsableNet using AI, if at all, or what are the plans?
So AI for us will be like, to start with, we're looking from a broad perspective. So one of the first things that we're doing is there's some industry initiatives about sharing data to the AI models that is private data to the work that we do to help improve those AI models at doing what we do. So for example, on a monthly basis, we have teams that work with clients to identify millions of accessibility issues and then remedy those millions of issues. All that data is very useful, but it's all private. It's not publicly available to the AIs today. So you'll see a number of vendors where we want AI to know more about our industry. To do that, we have to open up our own data about those types of interactions, the finding of issues, the common remedies of those issues. That data needs to get into the AI systems to then be useful for the broader industry to use as part of that, as part of those AI models. The second part that we see really valuable about AI is the simplification of accessibility for people who aren't accessibility experts. So today we're working on how to make sure that the reports that we generate for companies, the audits that we generate for companies, the executive summaries that we generate for companies can be input into ChatGPT and then queried in ChatGPT. So essentially you get ChatGPT to read the audit for you, and then you're able to actually ask it normal questions. You don't have to understand how our audit or how our executive summaries are organized. You can say, hey, how's our company doing compared this month over last month? So using AI as a way of simplifying and making information about the activity that's happening with regard to accessibility more available to different stakeholders who aren't necessarily accessibility experts. So there are two examples of how we see AI helping a broader group of stakeholders in the accessibility space.
Okay. Are you aware of any efforts to create tools that automatically create alternative text for images and that use the surrounding page context to inform the alt text they suggest?
There's a few. I mean, even Microsoft, as I talked about, Microsoft's open image analyzer will do exactly that for you. I mean, you can put an image into it and it will give you a suggested alternative text. A lot of the times it might be a little bit verbose for your context that you might have. So, you know, if it's an image of a kettle, you know, on an e-commerce site, the appropriate alt tag might be silver kettle made of, you know, aluminium and black plastic. But the Microsoft AI might give a far more verbose description of that in terms of where it's sat in the picture, what it's sat on. So you obviously need to take these examples or suggestions and potentially still have the sort of context component. But there are definitely systems already today that you can use that will give you image descriptions. And these are very useful if outside of, let's say, websites. Image descriptions that are automatically generated in social media, I think, are extremely valuable, and they're being used today. You know, the ability to describe images automatically for screen reader users on Instagram is a great use of that technology and that type of AI.
Okay. I have a clarifying question for Lori. When you say demand letters, can you explain what that means?
Certainly. Anything else there, Bethany?
Yes. Do you mean blackmail or just companies receiving letters from concerned users requesting accessibility concessions?
So what I'm talking about in a demand letter is not a blackmail letter per se, but it's basically an individual with a disability has hired an attorney and has found accessibility barriers on a website. And rather than proceeding immediately to just filing a lawsuit against the company, they will often have the attorney draft what's called a demand letter that is more of an informal way of trying to get and seek remedies from the company to fix the website and potentially to pony up some monetary compensation to the aggrieved individual. So it's simply a letter signed by a lawyer who represents an individual with a disability and identifying the problem, you know, what portion of the website is inaccessible and what they are seeking in the way of relief.
And Laurie, I have a follow-up question on that, because I'm always interested in like legal person's perspective. You know, we track, and some may have heard at the beginning, we track actual lawsuits. So we track federally and state filed lawsuits. And last year there's about 4,000 of those lawsuits. So person hires lawyer submits a lawsuit at a court rather than a demand letter. Some lawyers tell us that demand letters are actually even more prevalent. What's your feeling in terms of how prevalent are demand letters over actually going to actual lawsuits?
Well, they are much more voluminous than actual lawsuits that are filed, which would be a complaint filed with a court. The problem is there are no statistics on who receives demand letters and how many, because that information is non-public and confidential. So there's really no way to know. But I would say I would not be surprised if the order was 3 or 4 times the volume of actual lawsuits that are filed. That would be my educated guess.
Thank you.
Okay, great. So we are pretty much at time. So I want to go ahead and just confirm again that we did record today's session. So you will get a copy of that in your email. That email will be ready early next week. Also, we have a survey. It's just 4 questions that will pop up at the end of this webinar. If you could please, if you are still with us, just take a minute, complete that and let us know how we did. Any feedback that you have, we use to generate future content and to improve. So would really appreciate that. I want to thank everyone for attending today. I want to thank our speakers, Jason, and of course, Lori, our featured guest presenter. And before we conclude, I'll just ask first from Lori and then for Jason for any final thoughts.
Well, thanks first for Laurie giving her time. I think it's very important to understand the legal aspect of this. And, you know, as I said before, I'm really positive towards how AI is going to empower the disability community, and really excited to see if it's as empowering and as game changing as the internet has been.
And Jason, I agree with you. I think that AI holds much promise, but like all things, it's going to take a few years for it to become more refined in its use, and also for us to see how the new legal framework plays out, governing the use of AI data as well as development and deployment.
Great. So that is going to conclude today's webinar.